faithfully convey value and interpret great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Club. Today we're exploring Harold Lasswell's 1927 book, Propaganda Technique in the World War. Lasswell is one of the founding figures of modern communication studies. This book evolved from his doctoral dissertation in political science at the University of Chicago. Interestingly, this political science dissertation became a foundational classic that established communication studies as a discipline. This reveals how information dissemination is fundamentally rooted in political necessity. From 1923 to 1925, Lasswell traveled to London, Paris, Berlin, and other locations, conducting extensive fieldwork by interviewing government officials and experts involved in wartime propaganda, and reviewing vast archival materials. Ultimately, Lasswell made the startling discovery that without propaganda efforts, warring nations couldn't even mobilize their full national resources for war, much less achieve victory. Essentially, World War I was fought on three fronts, with propaganda warfare being the primary battleground, followed by economic warfare, and finally, direct military conflict. With scholarly rigor and neutrality, Lasswell meticulously analyzed the organizational structures, objectives, methods, techniques, successes, and failures of propaganda in major combatant nations. He distilled fundamental principles governing effective propaganda, resulting in the classic work we're discussing today. Due to the negative connotations of propaganda in Western contexts, and the book's exceptionally sophisticated technical analysis, critics immediately denounced it upon its 1927 publication as a Machiavellian manual that corrupted morals and demanded its destruction. Such fierce criticism suggests the book indeed spoke uncomfortable truths with remarkable insight. We'll now examine the book's essence through three key sections. Part 1. What is propaganda? Part 2. The 5 primary objectives of wartime propaganda. Part 3. 3 fundamental tactical principles of wartime propaganda. Let's begin with Part 1. What is propaganda? The English word propaganda comes from Latin, meaning to spread ideas. Originally, English speakers didn't use this term. It wasn't until World War I broke out, when nations actively engaged in propaganda efforts, that it truly entered everyday language. So, since propaganda spreads ideas rather than facts, combined with the immense suffering from the world wars, the public grew to despise it. This led people to adopt more neutral and positive terms like public relations to replace it. But fundamentally, they're the same thing. Both use symbols to manipulate opinions. That's precisely the definition given by Professor Lasswell. Here, symbols refer to carriers of information, like language, images, films, music, flags, logos, and so on. Humans perceive objective reality through these symbols, so by manipulating symbols, you can naturally alter others' perceptions. By shaping subjective perceptions of objective reality, we use symbols to control opinions, essentially controlling minds and souls through information control. So, how do warring nations organize their propaganda efforts during wartime? Lasswell identified 3 main organizational forms. First, establishing a dedicated wartime propaganda agency, monopolized by specialists. Second, forming a propaganda committee with representatives from various government departments to coordinate efforts. Third, having government departments conduct propaganda separately, each doing their own thing, with only joint press conferences. Clearly, the first form is the most organized, the second less so. The third is the most loose. During World War I, major combatant nations chose different forms based on their specific circumstances. The Americans adopted the most organized first form, creating a dedicated wartime propaganda agency. Because the U.S. entered the war in 1917 when the situation was clear, they didn't have to worry about complex alliances or bureaucratic red tape and historical baggage. The British used the second form, setting up a joint committee to coordinate propaganda across departments. The British Empire was vast, with internal dominions and colonies, external allies, and ambiguous neutral partners. Interests and conflicts were tangled, so a joint committee allowed everyone a say and decisions by consensus. But by 1918, Britain began appointing dedicated personnel to strengthen unified leadership of the Propaganda Committee. Therefore, in the later stages of World War I, British propaganda organization became more tightly structured. As for the Germans, due to the entrenched bureaucratic traditions of continental governments, each department had its own historical legacy and cultural traditions, especially those hard-headed individuals in Prussia, the General Staff, and Imperial Army and Navy departments. Expecting them to surrender their propaganda authority? Ha! Not a chance. Thus, Germany had no choice but to adopt the most decentralized organizational approach. Each government department did its own thing normally, only holding joint press conferences when absolutely necessary. So, what kind of people are best suited for propaganda work? Professor Laswell believed journalists were naturally the best candidates. Journalism and propaganda are fundamentally connected. Both involve information dissemination. Therefore, when it comes to achieving optimal communication impact, professional journalists possess the most practical expertise. Yet there's a core difference. Journalism focuses on reporting facts, while propaganda aims to convince you its message is factual. Journalism prioritizes breaking news first, while propaganda waits for the most opportune moment. Journalism emphasizes balanced reporting, while propaganda often fixates on single points, ignoring everything else. Journalism serves the public by delivering current information, while propaganda seeks to control the public and harness their power. Laswell stated that every core principle of journalism directly contradicted WW1 propaganda practices. The essential methods for propaganda were precisely what journalism strived to avoid. Thus, by reversing journalism's biggest taboos, you get propaganda's perfect formula. Britain's exceptional WWI propaganda success stemmed largely from appointing a newspaperman as committee chairman, the founder of modern British journalism. Visit Northcliffe. Born Alfred Harmsworth, known as the Napoleon of British journalism. He began his journalism career at 15, later founding several highly successful newspapers. Knighted in 1905 for his journalism contributions, he gained control of the Times in 1908, henceforth dominating British journalism. Viscount Northcliffe famously said about newswork, "Never forget, you're writing for those with limited knowledge." It was this journalistic genius who chaired Britain's National Wartime Propaganda Committee during W1, successfully directing the nation's propaganda efforts. On the propaganda front, he crushed the Germans into total defeat. As for the Germans, their propaganda failure directly resulted from poor personnel choices in their propaganda apparatus. Within German government propaganda departments, high-ranking officials and aristocratic lords overflowed. These career bureaucrats displayed typical elitist arrogance, looking down from above while mastering their professional domains. Yet they couldn't grasp what ordinary people cared about, understand their emotions, or see things from common folks' perspective. However, the entire purpose of propaganda is precisely to influence this silent majority. Professor Laswell describes a classic case. In 1915, a British nurse was arrested by Germans after helping captured Allied soldiers escape. After her execution, British propaganda aggressively spun it into ironclad evidence of German brutality and inhumanity. The fierce international backlash left Germany cornered. Soon after, the Allies did the exact same thing. 2 German nurses were shot for trying to help German POWs escape. But German media stayed silent. A neutral journalist confronted Germany's propaganda chief. "Why aren't you countering British propaganda?" To everyone's shock, the German bureaucrat froze and asked, "Why? What do you mean?" The journalist clarified, "Well, didn't Allied soldiers execute your nurses recently? You could mobilize your propaganda machine to strike back in the court of public opinion." The baffled bureaucrat responded, "What? Protest? But those nurses were executed for aiding prison escapes that's legally justified?" This epitomized elite arrogance. Ignorance isn't the real danger. Arrogance is. This professional bureaucrat in Germany's propaganda department knows legal texts inside out, likely has a prestigious law degree, but just doesn't grasp human nature or propaganda. All right, so far we've covered what wartime propaganda work is, how it's organized, and how to select suitable propaganda talent. Next, we enter the second part of this book to examine the 5 major objectives of propaganda work in war. The primary objective of propaganda work is, of course, to justify the nation's engagement in war. Apart from the very few who directly benefit from war, virtually no one actually likes war. Take Britain at that time, for instance. The working class generally believed war was a conspiracy orchestrated by the bourgeoisie. The church believed British Christians shouldn't kill their German counterparts. Businesses worried about investment losses in enemy nations. Even the most conservative patriots thought Britain's greatest enemy had long been Russia. Right. Great. And so, why go fight to the death with our German cousins? Therefore, to wage a world war, each government's primary task was to morally justify their participation. The British claimed they entered the war to defend international law, fulfill treaty obligations, and protect peace among democratic nations. By eliminating Prussian militarism under German tyranny, they could achieve lasting peace for future generations. The French, needless to say, always fight wars to defend abstract moral principles like liberty, equality, fraternity, while also reclaiming Alsace and Lorraine, territories seized by Germany in the previous Franco-Prussian War. In contrast, the war goals promoted by German propaganda were clearly inferior, merely fighting to spread German civilization. You see, you can fool the entire world. Fighting for permanent peace can also fool the entire world. Fighting for liberty, equality, fraternity can absolutely fool them too. People without German blood. Beyond abstract moral principles, whether Britain, France, or Germany all unanimously rallied under patriotism to persuade the working class into war and raised banners glorifying God. They convinced churches to support the war, mobilized conservatives and patriots by promising to reclaim lost lands or conquer new territories, and lured businesses by baiting them with crushing competitors and opening new markets. The propaganda strategies of each nation worked. On the eve of war, within just 1 month, public opinion across nations shifted dramatically to support the conflict. The most emblematic transformation was that of a French labor movement leader in 1914. Before June, this labor leader had denounced the war as an imperialist conspiracy. But by July, as war loomed, he performed a complete U-turn, renaming his newspaper from Social Revolution to Victory and writing articles enthusiastically praising the coming war against Germany. After draping their nation's entry in moral justification, propaganda's second major goal became justifying enemy annihilation. Proposing moral objectives to mobilize masses for war is one thing. Convincing people to take arms and kill another group of living humans, that's entirely different. Humans are fundamentally good. They tremble killing chickens, won't jaywalk. So how could they suddenly become enthusiastic killers? What magic did these propaganda machines cast on their people? The magic was making people believe enemies were treacherous brutes who'd forfeited humanity, degenerating into soulless demons. For instance, propaganda machines on both sides exaggerated enemy soldiers' wartime atrocities, such as massacring children, burning villages. Even any battlefield epidemic was instantly branded as enemy bioweapons. Early in the war, British papers denounced the German Kaiser as Europe's rabid dog. French media confidently declared him the devil, Satan, prophesied in scripture. This German demonization peaked on June 22, 1915. That day's London Morning Post featured a column. However the world classifies itself, only 2 species exist today, humans and Germans. When Allied soldiers believed Germans across the trench had degenerated into rabid dogs or demons, pulling the trigger carried no psychological burden. After successfully demonizing the enemy, propaganda's third goal became instilling unshakable faith in victory among their own people. You can wave the moral banner for joining the war and prove to your people that the enemy are bloodthirsty demons. But if your folks believe the enemy's going to win in the end, your morale's still going to collapse. The key is to actively shape people's understanding of the war situation. Whether this matches the real battlefield truth doesn't matter at all. What counts is making folks believe we're gonna win in the end. Say we lose a battle, it ain't 'cause we're weaker, our troops ain't brave enough, or our leaders are useless. It's 'cause the enemy broke their word, ambushed us, or shamelessly stole our battle plans. Or maybe there's just too many of them, and we're hopelessly outnumbered. Anyway, our guys could have won, and the enemy ain't always gonna be so darn lucky.
On top of that, there's a flashier way, spreading mystical prophecies to hammer home the idea that we're bound to win.
We Chinese ain't new to this trick. Ancient times had prophecies like Great Chu rises, Chen Sheng reigns, or eating an eye, stirring the Yellow River to revolt for political hype. And Westerners? Oh, they know this propaganda game too. During WW1, the French had a prophecy floating around. Way back in 1600, a big-shot Christian monk predicted a German king named Wilhelm II would surrender where he forged his weapons. And yeah, everybody knew the wartime German emperor was Wilhelm II. Among Germans, their prophecy said war victory would go to 3 emperors and 3 kings. Well, that meant the emperors of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, plus the kings of Bavaria, Saxony, and Bulgaria. We all know in WWN, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria were allies, and Bavaria and Saxony were key states in the German Empire. Oh, the Brits had their own political superstitions, too. In 1916, British folks spread a prophecy. Britain joined the war in 1914, fought it in 1915, would escalate in 1916, and win it all in 1917. Sure, only the battlefield's final showdown proved whose prophecy hit the mark. But hey, what's the diff? Anyway, by that time, the war was already over. The fourth purpose of wartime propaganda is to unite allies and inspire them to persist in fighting. For example, in 1917, Italy's morale was low after the front line collapsed. The Americans, who had just joined the Allies, sent soldiers to form propaganda teams before the main forces could land in Europe. They marched in armed parades through major Italian cities, showcasing American military strength while inspiring Italian allies. Persist in fighting on. Another way to unite allies is to promote the deep friendship among allied nations. Observers were shocked to find that Britain and France, who had deep-seated hatred from the medieval Hundred Years' War to the modern Napoleonic Wars, had fought for hundreds of years. In 1913, a popular nursery rhyme in Paris was still, "England, never ever dream of dominating France." But by 1914, after World War I broke out, feelings between the British and French people warmed rapidly. They recognized each other as strong pillars of the so-called democratic system. Firm defenders of permanent peace. It was almost nauseatingly sweet. Even the Russians, traditionally hostile to Britain and considered barbaric and backward by Western Europeans, quickly became whitewashed in the British government's propaganda system after becoming allies, portrayed as brave fighters. Great Christians who would reclaim Christian holy lands from Turkish infidels, great defenders of Christian civilization. Almost as important as uniting allies is winning over neutral nations. The ideal outcome is getting them to join our side. If not, at least prevent them from joining the enemy. To win over neutral nations to our side, we need to activate the propaganda machine. In the minds of neutral nations' public, label the enemy as such, or convince the masses that joining us aligns with some moral principle serves their interests best, or both. Throughout World War I, the British government's propaganda machine ceaselessly disseminated to neutral nations' public. Agree how cruel and brutal the German army was, how tyrannical the German emperor was. Germany's militaristic tradition posed a huge threat to everyone, and so on. The German government's propaganda machine also ran day and night, spreading how brutal the Russian forces on the Eastern Front were and how tyrannical the Russian Tsar was. Russia's imperialist tradition posed a huge threat to everyone. During wartime, whether for the Allied powers like Britain and France or the Central Powers like Germany and Austria, the propaganda focus on neutral nations was undoubtedly winning American public support. The, and for this purpose, British propaganda leveraged linguistic and cultural advantages to desperately exaggerate the terrible consequences for America if Germany won in Europe. For example, a Germany that conquered Europe might blockade America, land in neighboring countries, or even directly wage war to conquer the US and force its submission. From then on, America's next generation might have to collectively learn German. After all, everyone knew Britain's military was fully tied down on the Western Front. Meanwhile, America was Britain's biggest wartime financier and the largest manufacturer of British war supplies. While Britain lacked capability or motive for war against America, German propaganda countered that Japan, Britain's ally seeking Pacific hegemony, was highly likely to attack the US. Suddenly, Germany's propaganda machine went full throttle, desperately promoting the Japanese threat theory to Americans. Unfortunately, though Germans accurately predicted the US-Japan Pacific War 2 decades later, it didn't help their cause in the 1917 World War. In April 1917, the US declared war on Germany. Propaganda's fifth goal became undermining enemy morale. Make enemy citizens believe their government's moral goals were just facades, tricking them into becoming cannon fodder. We're not the monsters your government claims. We're decent people like you, even friends. We're stronger, and you stand no chance.
And the allies you trust are actually your real enemies.
During WN1, Germans published newspapers in occupied France, constantly promoting German-French friendship. The British are our common enemy, they proclaimed, often with photos of kind German soldiers affectionately holding French children, all smiles. For example, to get French folks to see these pro-German papers, German propaganda cleverly printed lists of fallen French soldiers right alongside stories pushing German-French friendship. Reports about German soldiers being a civilized force were published together too. This ensured all those symbols manipulated by German propaganda were delivered spot on, reaching French civilians desperate to know their loved ones' whereabouts. On top of that, Germany's propaganda towards Russia was lively, with the machine stirring up class and ethnic conflicts inside Russia. It insightfully pointed out that Russian folks and soldiers' real enemies weren't kind, brave, civilized German people, but the Russian government and ruling class oppressing you and sending you to the front as cannon fodder. Looking back, Germany nailed its propaganda towards Russia. And no, as for splitting the Allied bloc, the German propaganda machine had its shining moments too. Germans pushed the Russian threat theory to the Brits, saying if Russia conquered Turkey, they'd cut off Britain's route to India, ending the empire. When dealing with the French, Germans hyped up the British threat theory instead. Now, the German propaganda machine urged French folks not to forget Britain's history of invading France, claiming Germans would ally with the French against British oppression, and so on. Of course, the Allied propaganda wasn't slacking off. British and French efforts focused on convincing Germans and troops of Allied might and inevitable German collapse, especially after the US joined. Countless fancy printed leaflets flowed into German trenches and back home through all sorts of channels. Leaflets showed images of wealthy American soldiers, the Allies controlling most global wealth, flaunted Americans' lavish lifestyles to Germans struggling under blockade, trying to show how pointless resistance was against such material power. Another key focus of Allied propaganda towards Germany was stoking class conflicts, inciting social revolution, and exploiting ethnic tensions in Austria-Hungary to promote national self-determination, all to weaken the Central Powers. In November 1918, sailors rebelled at Germany's Kiel port, sparking revolution and Germany's surrender. Simultaneously, Austria-Hungary dissolved due to ethnic issues, fracturing into today's smaller nations across Central and Southern Europe, thus ending World War I. All right, that concludes Part 2. Now, on to the book's Part 3, Three Fundamental Tactical Principles of Wartime Propaganda. First, Professor Laswell argued that no society is monolithic. Publics can be segmented by gender, age, profession, class, religion, ethnicity, etc. Each group has distinct psychological traits, political views, interests, knowledge levels, and judgment. Propaganda departments must meticulously differentiate and study these groups, understand their targets, grasp their pain points, and tailor approaches using each audience's preferred methods. For example, the same message in grassroots communities with limited education might use crude formats. Say, composing a vulgar song mocking the German Kaiser, lyrics can be explicit if catchy and easy to sing, but you'd never attract elites with crude tunes. Instead, commission scholars to write rigorous academic treatises proving the Kaiser's demonic nature. Second, Laswell noted battlefield conditions shift rapidly, inevitably bringing setbacks. When bad news breaks, if denial and suppression fail, counter its impact. Truthfully, no propaganda machine can fully block damaging leaks. Walls have ears, after all. And if you hide unfavorable news only for truth to surface, the credibility damage often outweighs the original blow. So when setbacks happen, the right approach is counter tactics, reporting favorable news prominently alongside unavoidable bad news. If there's no good news yet, just wait till it happens. Churchill was a master at this game. During WWN, Churchill served as Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty. He'd suppress unfavorable battle reports until positive ones emerged, then release them together. First share minor bad news, then major good news. This worked brilliantly, and Germans perfected it too.
When America joined the Allies against Germany, their propaganda machine immediately blared news of Russia's imminent collapse
And Germany's looming Eastern Front victory. To be fair, both were true. German propagandists didn't hide America's entry, but spotlighted Eastern victories, crucially sustaining German morale. Finally, Laswell argued that distorting facts, even lying, was tactically necessary for propaganda goals. But if you must lie, avoid easily debunked falsehoods. Never contradict yourself when addressing the same audience. Laswell's research revealed rampant lies in both sides' WWN propaganda. Germans found a photo of Russian troops massacring Jews and propagandized it instantly. But the event actually occurred in 1905. Germans just altered the date, while British deception was more sophisticated. In 1915, British papers reported German officers looting battlefields. Accompanying photos showed 3 officers grinning with a gold cup, but Laswell proved it was actually their 1914 equestrian trophy, taken pre-war. Another infamous photo claimed Germans sent dead soldiers to soap factories. Professor Laswell's research later revealed the truth. British troops captured 2 German war correspondents, and British intelligence officers found 2 photos during interrogation, one showing dead horse carcasses en route to a soap factory. The other was of fallen German soldiers. Looking at these photos, a British intelligence officer had a brainstorm. He swapped captions, so the German soldier's photo was labeled en route to soap factory. End quote. Such manipulation was impossible to guard against, leaving Germans defenseless. Thus, the image of German evil became deeply ingrained. So were Germans truly evil? Truth didn't matter, only belief in their evil did. Here, Propaganda technique in the World War draws to a close. Looking back, Professor Lastwell revealed propaganda as the art of controlling opinions through symbols. Wartime propaganda should be centrally managed by specialized agencies, with journalists best suited for the work. Propaganda has 5 objectives. First, justifying the nation's war entry. Second, justifying enemy annihilation. Third, instilling unshakable victory belief. Fourth, uniting allies and winning over neutrals. Fifth, undermining enemy nations. Propaganda should follow 3 tactical principles. First, target specific groups' pain points with tailored approaches.
Second, counter bad news by emphasizing favorable developments.
Third, if lying is necessary, avoid easily debunked falsehoods. Never contradict messages to the same audience. Well, that concludes our interpretation of propaganda technique in the World War. Reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.